Today on Accidental Experts with Bryce Hamilton.
Welcome to the Accidental Experts podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Hamilton. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a child and family therapist. I have been in practice for over 15 years, and I'm also a mom of 4. So I know the challenges both professionally and personally. I'm so glad that you're here today to grow your parenting toolbox. Please come as you are and be ready to learn. My goal is to make you the accidental expert so that you can raise healthy humans. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm so glad you're with us today. So we're going to be talking about such an important topic. We're going to be talking about how to talk to our kids about alcohol consumption. Spoiler alert, it's earlier is the better. Well, let's not wait until they have access to alcohol to start talking about that. But we have an expert, Jerod Breit, and he is with MADD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And he's going to give us all of his tips and tricks and all the information that he knows to help us have these important conversations. With that, let's get to Jerod.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so you work for MADD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Can you tell us what that is and what your mission is?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, MADD was started back in 1980 when a 13-year-old softball all-star, Carrie Leitner, was killed May 3rd of 1990 in California. She and a friend were walking to a church carnival, and at the same time, a 3-time repeat offender out of jail just 2 days from his 4th DUI arrest was barreling down the road. You know, he hit Carrie from behind, throwing her out of her shoes more than 125 feet away, then fled the scene. Eventually, he was later arrested and charged. And in that moment, Carrie became the real first face of drunk driving victims. She also represents the many, many, many pedestrian victims that are killed or injured due to drunk driving. Her mother, Candace Leitner, carried her daughter's photo with her as she worked, tirelessly to change drunk driving laws in California to try to make sense of a senseless act and turn their pain into purpose, which victims and survivors do every day. And our job is to advocate for them and be there through their grief journey, whatever that journey may be. We also have a phenomenal Power of Youth, Power of Parents program, which is on our prevention education side, as well as court monitoring. We monitor court cases to make sure that there's some consistency in the work that our judges and prosecutors do. And we support our law enforcement partners throughout the country every day.
Wow. I didn't realize, I believe I heard this story when I was in high school about the Mothers Against Drunk Driving. There was some type of a presentation that was done in my high school many years ago. And I did not remember the part that her daughter was walking. And in preparation for this interview, I didn't realize there were so many pedestrians that are hit by drunk drivers.
Yeah, it's of course that fatality number is not as high as the number in motor vehicles, but really when we talk about the pavement, we talk, whether it's you happen to be on a sidewalk or on the street, these deaths are just as tragic and just as often as others. And so when we talk about pedestrians or bicyclists, that's why when we're in our communities working with coalitions, like the Drive to Zero Coalition, a big piece of this is not only how do we end impaired driving, right? And at MADD, this is where impaired driving ends, but how do we make our roads safer? How do we make our response times quicker for first responders? Mm-hmm. And what type of education are we doing with our schools, our youth, and those people in our community?
Yeah, I think prevention in this case is key to solving this problem. Is that the path that you guys are taking to end drunk driving?
Yeah, absolutely. And our mission is to end drunk and drug driving, to support victims of these violent crimes and to prevent underage drinking. And I think it's important to remember that, when we talk about violent crime, this is a violent crime and it is 100% preventable. And it all starts with that choice. And that's why I'm glad that we're here talking today about, how do we communicate with parents? How do we communicate with students about impaired driving? But also, really, it's about decision making and accountability, and those are the conversations we have every day, with children, inside the home and outside the home. And so it's a great opportunity for us to be here and to provide some context, some support, and some of the things that we do to try to change behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm thinking about, how do we start these conversations with our kids? Because ultimately, it's probably the conversations around alcohol and driving are probably not just teen or being 21. It's really something that we're probably modeling as parents, and also just, like modeling that we're not getting in the car after driving. We're being careful about that. I mean, talk to me about what the thoughts are. How do we have conversations around this?
Yeah, I definitely think, actions speak louder than words. And so, modeling that behavior, our children all kids are paying attention. I mean, if as an adult, if you've ever been to the airport and sat there and people watched, you're going to watch what these people do. Your
Sure.
kids are super focused on you as their role models, as their guiders as they grow up. And so watching what they do, if they're doing it all the time, I have, it's the old, if they hear a curse word, they're going to go to school and say the curse word. And then you're going to be like, oh my gosh, where did they learn that? Well, they learned it from watching and listening to us. But I think, the big step here, the big first piece of talking and having conversations and really working to start the discussion is to be educated. So really listening to this is that first step, is how do I become educated in having the conversations. Many parents don't really know that the earlier someone begins drinking, the more likely they are to be alcohol dependent later in life. More than like 40% of individuals who start drinking at the age of 13 will develop alcohol abuse or alcohol dependence at some point in their lives. And 95% of the 14 million people who are alcohol dependent began drinking before the legal age of 21. I mean, that's just, so these conversations aren't just, oh, let's have another talk. From parents to child or in our schools, it's literally life and death. And this conversation can save lives, but to kind of further on that, I think, MADD has a Power of Parents program. And we provide this program really directly to parents, really to talk about how to have the conversation and to discover what type of parent or parenting style you have. So we're not only talking about statistics, but we're really talking about how you or the listener is going to have that conversation the right way, giving tips and tricks. As we know, like having any conversation with someone under the age of, I don't know, sometimes I think 25, but under the age of 21 is really hard. And so Power of Parents really dives deep into, how we can identify best practices, some tips about, what to do when you've hit a brick wall, which, can happen in discussions. But it's just really important to get educated and know that, underage drinking poses, a special risk. I mean, I really call it a special risk to young people. It's illegal. It's dangerous. And I think our program really helps to talk about that.
Is that something that's free online, or how do people get access to that program?
Yeah, absolutely. There are resources online at madd.org. Our staff in of course, not every state, because it's really dependent on federal and state funding. If we can go out and do Power of Parents and Power of Youth, but it certainly, there are resources online that will help them start the discussion. It's just not the in-person style that probably has the most impact when talking to parents. And I don't know, sometimes talking to parents can be just as hard as talking to kids, because we're not experts. We're not the end all be all. We're not counselors, but one thing we are is resources with evidence-based curriculum that is there to help you, the listener, have confidence to have those conversations, which is harder than a lot of people think it is.
Yeah. Well, and I find that, in my house, we do have occasional drinks. And so I have started conversations. Like, we went to the liquor store one day and my kids were like, "What is this place?" And I was like, "Huh, maybe," like, it really made me think that they were asking me questions like, why is there so much alcohol and those kind of things. And it facilitated a really good conversation around maturity and brain and being able to, like, why there's a legal age and our kids.
Yeah, I won't tell you who, but I'll say I know a parent whose kid calls it daddy's juice.
Hmm.
So, this is like a 9, 10-year-old, and that's not bad. That's actually good because there's some recognition there before the age of 13, which is really kind of that good, bad red line when it comes to talking about alcohol. That he knows that it's not for him,
Hmm.
right? The kid. And then that's a way to use that, just like you mentioned, that opportunity. Remember when we went to that store and you asked me XYZ? Well, now let's talk about something. I think the important piece is really talk early, talk often, and that depending on their age, they may not even seem interested in alcohol. Like that
Sure.
may not even register. So do your research on your parenting style and how to have those conversations.
Yeah. They are hard, and our kids sometimes put us on the spot of, like, we don't know what to say, but I also would encourage parents to know that, like, you don't have to have all the answers. It's okay
Yeah.
to not have all the answers. As a child therapist who's been doing this for a long time for kids, like, I don't have all the answers to all the things. And sometimes I'll say, like, "That's a really great question. I really appreciate you asking that. I'm gonna figure out what the answer is to that and get back to you." So it doesn't have to be that we know all the
Oh my
things right
gosh.
on the spot.
And I love that you just said that because I think that is key. And you'll read it in all the literature, but I think what you just said is key, and that's showing appreciation because they're looking. I say our children. I don't have kids, but I'm a great uncle if you ask my nephews. But
Yeah.
the reality is, in working with youth for the last 26 years, showing appreciation when having difficult conversations puts the youth, the child, in a position of confidence that,
Mhm.
this may not have been easy based on whatever experience they've had. Maybe someone else at school said something. So I really thank you for saying that because, I was going to mention at some point today that as a key component of how parents have those conversations with their kids is to really show appreciation for their views, their opinions, their
Mhm.
questions, even their misunderstanding of
Mhm.
things or confusion. I think that's important as well. They may just be confused, but as an adult, it's important to recognize that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and just being like, "Oh, I can understand how you came to that," or, "That is a confusing thing. Could I offer some thoughts that I have on that or what I understand that to be?" And I think, these hard conversations, when we come at it with curiosity and wanting to understand their point of view, what do they think? I find that we get way farther and get way more information. Sometimes even in my clinical setting, I have a very curious mindset, and so I'll ask lots of questions. And during that, kids and teens will definitely reveal things that I'm like, oh my gosh, I did not expect them to share that much. And so I so appreciate those moments where I do get that level of information.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember there are two there are two times that this conversation may come up. And even in the area where I'm at, the second has come up in the past year on multiple occasions. And that's, do we want to have these conversations post critical incident at our
Mhm.
child's school that may involve a child being severely injured or even tragically killed by an impaired driver? Or do we want to have these conversations so that if that ever happens, they're in a place of knowledge about alcohol to better understand how to deal with a tragedy like that? And again, you are an expert given your background, but I just think it's important to realize, like, you know, heaven forbid this conversation has to take place after something tragic. The reality is, talking often about these things, even the things that we don't, think about talking about all the time, is important.
Yeah. Well, and something I was just thinking is that whether it comes to education about bodies or sexual abuse or any of those kind of things, alcohol is also in this of like you have one choice basically. Somebody's going to educate your kids, and the question is it going to be you or is it going to be somebody else? And I think when our kids get information from us, that's going to be more reliable, more valid information. And we care about them. We don't want our kids to be part of anything, whether they are the cause or they are the victim. We do not want them to be either side of that. And if we have an opportunity to prevent that, let's do it.
Yeah. And I think, I think it's important to talk about research at certain times. And, um, research shows that kids who drink are a danger to themselves and their friends and others. For over 20 plus years, there have been clinical studies and high caliber quality clinical studies in the US and in Europe that have shown the earlier kids drink in life, the more severe problems they have, in the short term and long term. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, part of this as an adult is just understanding that the child's brain works differently, and that may guide us in when to have particular conversations about different topics, this being one of those. And, I think it's kind of cumulative, because drinking alcohol younger can have, serious effects on your body, including your brain. And so, I just think if brains aren't developed into their 20s, the younger and the more often we have these conversations with our children and youth and students, just the more impact that it could have, as a community and certainly as a society, as we're trying to change behavior.
Yeah. Well, and something I was impressed by also in doing research for this interview was that our rates of teens or people under 21, so the study said 12 to 20, that their use of alcohol has gone down. So like as a nation, it seems like we're trending a little bit down in terms of people who have tried alcohol for the first time.
Yeah, yes, that is true. Both in alcohol and the use of marijuana or cannabis. 1 in 8 and 1 in 7, I think, are the statistics that we use at MADD. But it's also critical to think about kids who start drinking young are also 7 times more likely to be in an alcohol-related crash.
Wow.
Adolescent drinkers who and I know we'll talk about this later, probably, but adolescent drinkers who perform worse in school are more likely to fall behind and have an increased risk of social problems, depression, suicidal thoughts, and violence if they're drinking as an adolescent. And so, yes, I think behavior impact and cultural impact are I don't want to say declining, because I'm always afraid to say declining, because then all of a sudden a new study comes out and it's not. But at the end of the day, like I do think teens are smarter than we are giving them credit for, because those numbers do decrease in teens and adolescents when we see numbers of adults in impaired driving crashes increase double digits since 2019. And that's after, 40 years of reducing 50% the number of fatality crashes. So again, I think if they were to have this conversation when they were younger, you know, and I'm not saying they didn't, but you know, I just think that these things have lasting impacts.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I was just thinking, like, the thing that was encouraging to me, seeing that teen numbers were trending a little bit down. It's not like gone for sure, but that seemed to be in a little bit of a trend down, is that what we're doing is helping. And so, like, that's positive. So, like, as a parent, I want to know that if I'm going to spend my time doing something, that I want to know that's actually going to help. Right. So if I'm going to help my kids study by reviewing flashcards a million times, I want to know that that is really going to help. And maybe it's not something about like taking them out and doing a worldview of something. Like, I want to do the most productive thing. And so I think it's great to know that having conversations, I mean, we don't have that for sure information there that wasn't on the graph, but I think that as MADD has been around and different organizations that are educating parents, educating kids, and working with legislators and judges to do this type of work, that is somewhat helping. And I think that that's important. And so we can do our part in this.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when those conversations take place, you know, one of the things that our Power of Parents program really talks about is, you know, don't lecture. Talk to them about their opinions, maybe even their thoughts if they have any, and use questions, right? To start, especially how, what, why. Kind of like how would you handle an invitation to a party with alcohol, or what would you say? For instance, why do you think drinking's dangerous at your age? I think those questions that really provoke a response and aren't really in that lecture style have more of an impact. And I think, you know, I think we could probably list a lot of reasons why those rates are declining at the rate they are. In Missouri, I know this past year we had you know, nearly 11,000 students go through our Power of Youth program in their schools. It's free. And so, you know, shameless plug, if you have kids that are in school and MADD has the Power of Youth program, you know, sometimes schools say no to us. And sometimes we don't know why. And the reality is most teachers who like Power of Youth is because we'll come in for an 8-hour period and the teacher gets, you know, theoretically the day off, right? Because we're there teaching every period about the Power of Youth program. So, you know, at the end of the day, that was my shameless plug for the Power of Youth, but it works. And, you know, we see use go down. I mean, this goes back 40 years to the DARE program and the GREAT program, the things that, you know, really law enforcement did kind of around really the same time, you know, that that MADD was founded, and you know, here we are, and still with DARE, GREAT, or MADD, we, you know, we lose sight of these things that should stay relevant just because of society and social media and news, and there's so many things going on in the world. Yeah, I just think this is a great opportunity for parents to remember that they can have the conversation.
Yeah. Okay. So you listed some really great ideas of kind of how to have this conversation with teens. And ideally we're starting earlier, but let's say we're here today, right? We have a teenager. We are preteen, maybe 13, 14. We're getting ready to be in this high school space, or we already are. How do we have this conversation about safe driving and alcohol? And just safe driving doesn't always mean alcohol's, you know, like anything to do with alcohol, right? Like, teenage drivers are at greater risk of having accidents just in general. But how do we start this conversation?
Well, I completely agree that you know, distracted driving is a piece of roadway safety. And just the other day, I was driving home, and there was literally a person watching a movie on their iPhone in their hand while they were driving. I mean, I assume it was an iPhone on their phone. And it just blows my mind, because if they're doing that, they're certainly not going to care about getting behind the wheel of a car impaired. But, you know, to your point earlier, and I might have misspoken just a tad, it's 7 out of 10 teenagers don't drink alcohol, and 8 out of 10 don't use cannabis or marijuana. So I wanted to clear that up. But when we're having the conversation, I think the first thing to think about is make the choice, right? With your child, make the choice that that they'll never consume alcohol or other drugs under the age of 21, right? And I think the second thing might be make a pact, like have your child or your student and their best friends make a pact with their friends to not use substances under 21, to realize, early on, you don't have to do everything by yourself. You don't have to do it alone or face these kind of big topics by themselves. I think the other one goes to the point you just made, which is respect the road, right? Get the commitment, gain the commitment from your child or student that safe driving practices are larger than just one small, but mighty conversation around impaired driving. And I think the other is have a plan, right? For when you're in a situation where there's alcohol or other drugs, look out for your friends, your peers, especially if you think they may be using substances. And then ultimately, I think it really boils down to never let a friend drive impaired. And certainly, just as important, never ride in a car where the driver is impaired. So never ride with an impaired driver. I think those are really important action items that can happen during a conversation. I know my sister is on an app, or sorry, is on a text string with like every parent in her neighborhood, and they talk about everything. So I'm really happy that she has that support system with parents who are going through the same things with the same age kids she has. And so, like, involve them. I think power of a community is, as I've seen, way more effective in changing culture or behavior when there's more support. There are more people involved. The conversation then doesn't become isolated to I have to sit down with my parents. It's we're talking about these things as friends and families and things like that. I think to the conversation, the other thing to do is really ask questions. And if you go to the MADD.org website in the Power of Youth section, there's some cool myth or facts, and these go a long way with like middle school age. So really a lot of what we've talked about so far are high school age, probably those folks that are around, that soon to be driver or current driver. But really, posing these questions to your middle school aged kids, like, myth, right? I can drink and handle myself just fine. I'm very mature for my age, which I'm not sure any middle schooler should be saying that. But the reality is, the fact is, it's not maturity, it's biology. And they may be learning about that in school. So the timing is great. And then talk about, the young body can't handle alcohol the way an adult can. It impairs judgment and your reflexes. So if they're playing sports and they're really, emphatic about playing sports, relaying or connecting how alcohol can impede the thing they like doing the most, I think is a great way to kind of drive it home, and to talk about those things. The other thing is to be truthful and honest. A great way is, hey, it's just a little alcohol. What's the harm? It's not that dangerous, right? That's coming from a student or a child. And it's important to tell them that, actually more than 4,300 deaths among people below the age of 21 in the United States each year come from alcohol consumption, not impaired driving, just alcohol consumption.
Wow.
4,300 kids. And so we don't do scare tactics. Like even in the Power Youth program, there's no scare tactics. We don't show pictures. We don't, tell stories about crashes or victim survivors. But we do kind of hey, you should know this, right? If we're going to talk about, things like fentanyl, things that are probably in the news every single day.
Sure.
We should also be talking about what alcohol does. And, in the state of Kansas, for example, over the last 40 years, the equivalent of 17 747s, fully loaded, crashing and killing everyone on board is the same number of people who have died at the hands of an impaired driver in the state of Kansas alone. Can you imagine if just one of those planes, if just a plane crashed in Kansas, a plane, small, whatever, the news would be there. Every law enforcement agency, every researcher, everyone wanting to try to figure out how can we prevent this from happening again? Well, we know how to prevent this.
Yeah.
And so as a community, a part of that is being truthful and talking about the things that impact us and the what if. I think it's often interesting to talk about the myths of marijuana or cannabis. A lot of kids think it's safer than other drugs like alcohol because it's not, according to them, addictive. But the reality is that it's this thing, right? Cannabis is just this thing, but it has ingredients, just like a cake that you bake. The cake's ingredients are good for you. Probably not if you're on a diet, but when we talk about cannabis, they're not. And THC, it stimulates brain cells to release dopamine. That creates this feeling of pleasure. But 1 in 11 adults who use cannabis become addicted. And the younger that someone starts smoking, they're at a higher risk. And 1 in 6 people who start in their teens will become addicted to marijuana. And there is just no one strain of cannabis, right? There are hundreds, and each one affects you differently. This is why, law enforcement and the judicial system are just having such a hard time really trying to nail down tests for cannabis because there are just so many strains.
Yeah. Well, and onto your point about addiction with marijuana, obviously there's addiction with alcohol too. And I think in the conversations I've had with my patients, sometimes they'll tell me it's not addictive. And I'm like, okay, tell me why. And I can tell you like 100 reasons why it is, right? Like there are plenty of people out there talking about, including psychiatrists, right, who are experts in the brain. And it does become addictive, right? And the thing that we're using it for oftentimes is not really what it solves, right? So we're having sleep problems, we're having anxiety, we're having depression. It doesn't actually cure those things. And I'm happy to provide research to support that you can talk to your kids about or have them listen to this great podcast that I found. But I think, that piece, it's important to educate, right? To give the real information because their friends are as, we'll say, naive as they are. They don't really know any different unless they've been told. And if it's working for them, so if it's working for Bobby, then it will probably work for me. And so then kids are more inclined to try that. And I also like the idea that you mentioned, creating a community around this to kind of bond these kids together to say like, hey, you guys you're going to go do stuff. You're going to be in situations, right, where you're going to be exposed to things and you have choices and you guys stick together. And I think it's way easier to say no to something that you really don't actually want to do because a lot of the teenagers tell me, I don't actually want to, right? Like, but I did it because, somebody else was doing it and I felt pressured or I was the only one saying no. And there they find themselves.
Yeah. And I think it's important to have clear rules, right? As a family or, whatever the case may be about, what to do if your teen is at someone's home. And adults aren't supervising and alcohol becomes available, right? Results from a lot of different studies, and I'm sure you've seen them, show that kids drink more often and heavier when alcohol is made available to them.
Yeah.
And so, one of the best practices is to have your son or daughter really understand that they should leave or call and text and a trusted adult for a ride if that happens, and to tell them it's okay to call and say this is happening, right? To remove you from that situation. I think kids are more likely to take advantage of that when whatever was happening, if there's not creating clear and imminent danger to life or limb. The reality is just to build that trust with your kids, and if they are in that environment, talk about asking a question like, what do you do if someone offers you alcohol? And then revert back, well, you told me I could call you. And so, these conversations should be going on. So you may have one conversation at 10, and then another one at 11. And by then they still remember what you talked about at 10. And so, really starting to connect the dots as their brain grows and they're able to do those things about the intentional way a parent is really talking to their kid about, substances and we say substances and alcohol, and it's really decision making, right? And the power of choice. And so, I had a kid not too long ago ask me, I drove by and saw a police. They didn't drive; they were in the back seat. But they drove by a police officer who was arresting someone on the side of the road. They don't know anything about it. And they said, was he getting arrested for driving drunk? And I said, I don't know, but whatever that person did was a choice. Somewhere along the line, they made a choice, and that was not in their best interest. And so that kid, I hope, now realizes, like, okay, my choices actually can lead to that, not just what a lot of people think is like, don't break the law. Okay, well, I can only not break the law when they don't connect yet that choices can lead to breaking the law, which can lead, to being arrested. And obviously not at that age, but talking about, adults in that situation.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and something I was thinking about as you're saying that, to have your kid reach out to you, I read an article a long time ago about this parent that when phones were coming out, they were saying, hey, text me an X if you need me to call you and say, hey, I got to pick you up. It's an emergency, whatever. And you have a plan already together. Parents not going to ask questions, just where you are and come to get you. And that signifies like, hey, we put this plan into place so that a kid doesn't have to call and say, hey, come pick me up, or text, because sometimes their friends are looking over their shoulder and they could easily say, oh, I just accidentally texted that. Like that was nothing, right? Like, not that we're encouraging them to lie, but in those situations where it can be life, like living through that event or potentially not, it's best for them to get out.
Yeah. And in that same scenario from earlier, got to think about, like, from a parent's perspective, just as a curious parent, go in and ask your insurance agent what will happen to your premiums if a child is injured at your house for consuming alcohol that you gave them. They're going to astronomical, right? Including civil suits that could come from that, or criminal charges that can come from that. So when it can't always be lovey-dovey. We can't always have the lovey-dovey talk. Sometimes we just have to talk about, here is what happens. You will get arrested because it's illegal to provide alcohol to a minor. Your insurance rates will go through the roof. And any civil claim that comes from any of that, talk about your homeowner's insurance and the things that really impact, a parent as they're raising a child and thinking about that child's future. It's not just about some of the things we've discussed here today. It's also about, like, reality of being an adult, which is all the things that your kid's not thinking about that you have to, right? And so I just, kind of taking that step back and asking your insurance agent or your family lawyer, or I sometimes at our victim impact panels for adult offenders, we bring in doctors and nurses. We bring in insurance agents. We bring in lawyers who do civil claims to talk about the effect of impaired driving outside of life, which is that side if you happen to get arrested and not kill someone or injure someone, which all those folks are living through that. And so, I also think kind of, part of this too is, when kids are in high school, the world is changed. It's not the same as when I was in high school. It's not the same as when you were in high school. And so, I remember I didn't have but like one AP course available to me. Now there's you can go into college as a junior.
That's wild. Yeah.
Right. And so think about the pressure, think about the stress, and these places that kids look for outlets, and be aware, any kid who's taking 6 AP classes as a junior or senior in high school, whether they tell you they're stressed or not, they are. I think about I don't know if you ever watched Modern Family.
Yes.
But they had the girl who was the smartest girl ever, but she was not happy and she was studying all the time and she had a breakdown. And, if you add into that the influence of alcohol or drugs to deal with some of those things that child's experiencing, at that point, it's too late, right? You have to be able to kind of look and identify some of these things that can lead to, it's not just that, alcohol and drugs are specifically marijuana are gateway drugs, or can be gateway drugs. It's also that stress can be a gateway to using drugs or alcohol. And so gateway doesn't just start. Gateway doesn't just start when you use the substance. Gateway can start much earlier. And those signs, I'm not a counselor. I'm not trained in that area, but the reality is, if you can graduate 12th grade and be a junior in college, that is a lot, right? Yes. That is just a lot. And so those are things to really, be aware of. And
yeah. Well, I was thinking, too, about what are the signs that parents could be looking for? And one of the things that you just mentioned in such a great way is just the pressure, right? How are your kids relieving stress and pressure? And I think when we use substances to help us cope with everyday things, like taking an AP class, although stressful, that is normal, right? It can be unhealthy stress, right? Depending on how the kid is metabolizing it, but we have to teach our kids how to handle stress. And if we're always using substances to handle our stress, then we are missing a really great opportunity to learn how to cope.
Yeah. And I think you're spot on. And, not an expert, but I think, right, in this line of work that, and working with youth for as long as I have, I think, 1 minute the kid wants to be an adult, right? They treat me like an adult. The next minute they want to be cared for like a child. And so just in that upswing and downswing, imagine what they're going through if that's the only piece you're seeing.
Yeah.
Is that up and down. And, I think teens especially really think that they're becoming more like adults and want to compete kind of in that same, space. And they can be embarrassed by their parents, things that are natural. But even, they may act like they're capable of handling those tough situations without the reinforcement, without the confidence to know that it is okay to say, I don't hang out with John anymore because John, I saw John smoking marijuana. Well, the reality is, wow, what a decision that kid just made. The next minute they could be in a situation where they approach it as a child, in peer pressure and with those stressors around them. And so I just think it's really important to talk about the impacts and of alcohol and choices, but also, I don't think there's any parent that is the perfect parent. And so being open to having conversations without, really being surprised. And that's the thing is like, a lot of these conversations I think can start from a point of surprise when they really shouldn't. You should know that these are the things kids are going to encounter. And the only way to counter the things they encounter is to have these conversations and be open and honest and give them an escape route. Like you said, with the X and the text, like what a great position of responsibility that parent put that child in. And the first time they do that, I think they're going to feel like, I'm responsible enough to do, something that my parents told me they would help me with. And then I got home and then they berated me and they did X, Y, and Z, but that's not going to help.
Yeah.
Right. If you're going to reinforce what these individual youth are doing, you have to be a part of the solution and not only point out the problem.
Yeah. I think that's a moment to be like, I am so proud of you. I was just thinking like, we're getting to this place in my kid's life where I'm going to introduce the X thing with my oldest, who's 12, and I could have introduced it earlier, but we haven't had a phone, so we're just getting to that place. Like we've always said, you can call anytime. Like if you're at a friend's house, you just get there, but you're ready to go, just call us, right?
And now the thing, like my nephew has an Apple Watch, doesn't have a phone, and the parents control who he can call. But like, knowing at 10 that there is a way to have that without using it for social media, without using it to, right? Sure. Like emergencies, and then connect those correlations to, here are some examples of when you should use this.
Yeah.
For me, he uses it to say, hey, what's up? For mom and dad, it's like, I'm in a difficult spot, or I want to go home and then get home and have the conversation. Luckily, I don't think that's happened to him, but I just think about, the increase in technology and the way that we can use that technology to our benefit, moving forward. Hopefully, in the next 4 to 5 years, the conversation we're going to be talking about is how to have the conversation with our soon-to-be drivers and new drivers about the anti-drunk driving technology that's going to be in all motor vehicles, all new motor vehicles.
That sounds amazing.
Like how do we have to talk about like what happens if you try to get behind the wheel impaired, and what to do. So that's why I really like this opportunity and where you were coming from and having this conversation, because the earlier it starts, the less likely that some sort of negative impact occurs long-term for the child.
Yeah. Yeah. And this parenting job, I know you're not in it, but like, it's hard. There's so many levels that are hard, that are conversations that I never imagined having. That, before having kids, before being a therapist, I was like, this is so easy. I just want to be a grown up and, make all my own decisions. Little did I know, I do have control of a lot of things, but it is way harder than I gave my parents credit for at the age of 10, for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, my favorite thing is I get a question from, my nephews, and I'm like, that's a great question. Let's ask your mom. Let's ask your mom.
Yes, shift it over.
But at the same time, I've noticed, being close to my nephews, every week and being able to see them, like they don't have a filter. And so it shouldn't surprise anyone when they ask what daddy's juice is, or when they ask, like, why is there so much alcohol in this store? That the next question is going to be why. And then, the old cartoons of like asking why after every response for 30 minutes. And then by that time, dad jumps out of the car and runs away. The reality is just that I think I think the youth are more inquisitive now than they've ever been, because of the things that are more readily available to them. For my sister and I were just talking about the fact that when we were growing up, we had a physical copy of an encyclopedia.
Yes.
different books, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the,
Mm-hmm.
the nephews were like, well, I had no idea what you're talking about. Well, the 20 years from now, we're going to be in a different space than we're in today. And so
Sure.
having these conversations aren't one and done. They are long-term,
Mm-hmm.
consistent, open, transparent. Just, one of the greatest things my parents ever did for me was to tell me, if you ever need us, call us.
Yeah.
And I took advantage of it, and sometimes I didn't.
Yeah.
And there are just those times that you having these consistent, open conversations can really drive decision making in a
Mm-hmm.
pattern that eventually makes their choices more sustainable for life, literally.
Yeah.
And as a police officer, I spent 10 years as a police officer in the city of St. Louis. And half my time I was on patrol and interacting with the citizenry and talking to and with community members. And I could meet over and over and over the same criminal, and also meet their child. And every I remember one in particular, and the child was always like, "I will never do that." They're learning, and so what I fear, and it wasn't my place, but my fear was that, like, they're having no conversations about right and wrong. They're not talking about choices. Um, but what that kid did realize is that that is not what he wanted to be,
Mm-hmm.
and that could easily go the other way,
Mm-hmm.
right? When you're an adult, a parent who's having a blast every single night, consuming lots of alcohol, and you look like you're having fun, uh, they're going to see that. Kids can see that and mimic that, and those type of interactions or actions by others can really influence kind of their next decision. And that's just what I think everybody wants, is to, like, how can we help impact that decision before the wrong one is made, and something
Mm-hmm.
totally preventable is unfortunately committed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I had mentioned talking about, like, knowing when you're like somebody, a teen in your house maybe is experimenting with alcohol. And I think, the things that come to my mind, because I know this is more my space probably than yours. But the things that come to my mind is like withdrawing, right? Like if a kid is starting to withdraw, if they're not wanting you to meet their friends, which somewhat is normal, but like I think as teens, like I still wanted my parents to know of my friends. I still wanted my friends to be at my house. And so like keeping that in mind, also like coming in reeking of alcohol or any type of substance, right? Smelling like really heavy cologne or perfume when they didn't leave like that, or chewing intensely flavored gum. It's not saying that that means that's what your teen is doing, but get curious, right? Ask some questions, right? Just have your sensor up to be noticing that. And hopefully, through having these conversations proactively, we're not in that position. But I think also you don't have blinders on, right? Be aware of what your kids are also doing and have expectations of their behavior and expectations of your family members of like, this is how we act in this family. I think that helps kids to also be able to make the decisions that are consistent with the life they really want to live. But sometimes it can be hard to make those choices. So, what do you think you can do if you find out that your kid has driven under the influence? And obviously, even if they were 21, right? Like whether they're a minor or not, they're home safe, right? Somehow. Um, how can we respond to that as parents? I think that can be a really tricky place to be.
Yeah, I think a great place to start is, by that point, right? We're at an impasse, right? We're at this place where you're lucky that your child is there for you
Mhm.
to find out
Mhm.
that they drove impaired. And I think the first thing to do, right, with technology these days, and the multimedia brains of these kids. I think it's really important to sit them down and go to MADD's website and watch the victim stories. Hear directly from parents, but also, unfortunately, a lot of those stories involve kids who are brothers and sisters who are in scouts with the victim of an impaired driving fatality, and talking directly to the camera about the things they experienced, the things that they're still experiencing, and try to drive home that this conversation or this action that you did isn't just happening in these four walls.
Mm-hmm.
Let me show you some examples of people that you identify with, right? And I will tell you the number of offenders that tell me that the person on the screen reminds them of their grandma or their mom or dad. And this kind of switch kind of flips, and they're like, that could be me.
Mm-hmm.
That could be my parents talking about me, or talking about the parents of the person that I killed. And so I really do think like that video multimedia approach is always going to be more effective, because that's where these kids' brains are, right? They're in these short, lesson learning phase where like they can watch a 40-second thing and remember it 3 weeks from now. Whereas like we didn't grow up like that. And so I think that's a great opportunity. I think the other is to go to a community event with law enforcement or other first responders like paramedics or firemen. And can you talk to us? I'd like can you talk to my son or daughter and let them know like the things you've experienced? Don't lecture them. Don't tell them you're going to put them in jail. But the reality is, share your experience. Because when you're real, when you're able to talk about those things in an open environment, I think even if it is a police officer, I know so many police officers, Bryce, who they themselves are the victim survivor of an impaired driving crash, many of whom took their parents. And here today, they are serving their community, working to take impaired drivers off the street. And so when you have, such dedicated individuals who don't want to always deal with Joe criminal or Jane criminal, but want to have a deep conversation or an open conversation, I think they do it in a heartbeat. Talk about public service. To me, that is a public service. And I know like every first responder out there would be happy to have those conversations, because unfortunately the world they live in, they see the worst things that you could possibly see. And their experience, I think, can help impact that. So multimedia, and I think MADD has some great resources that you don't have to, right? Don't hear it from me, take it from them. As well as like engage your first responders. Go to a firehouse. Walk right in. Ask them, my son or daughter drove impaired, and I was hoping you could share some stories with us to try to figure out like what happens if I do it again. I think that's a great way.
Yeah. I was thinking about one of the first calls. My husband used to be a paramedic, and one of the first calls that he went to was 5 kids from his high school. The driver is drunk, and all of them are dead. So that was, that hurts my heart, and I didn't even know him then when that happened. But I think it's very close to home. I don't think my parents would say about drunk driving or just like drinking and driving. They're like, it's not when it will be you, or if it will be you, it's when, right?
Absolutely.
You are going statistically. Are you willing to take that risk? And I was like, no, I'm not willing to take that risk.
I hear a lot from offenders who were in that situation that they said, I never thought it could happen to me. And one of the things we're working hard at MADD nationally, but also here locally, is passing Bentley and Mason's law. And Bentley and Mason are these 2 boys under the age of 10. They're amazing. So great to be around. They lost both of their parents and their 4-month-old baby brother in a crash. And one of the key components of Bentley and Mason's law is that if you kill the parents of a child, you are responsible for the financial well-being of that child whose parents were killed until they're 18 years old. The first time I told that, right when we started doing this a couple of years ago, to a room of offenders, I mean, yeah, there are some light switches that happen with different things, and you could see that the processing of, for lack of a better term right now, the child support or the support of that child financially, for an 18-year-old, even a 21-year-old or a 22-year-old, can you imagine living the next 20 years having to pay because you took parents from another child, right? I mean, you want to talk about things that impact us on a daily basis to try to deter you from committing this crime is, you're right. Everybody thinks it can't be them until you tell yourself it absolutely can. And here's what's going to happen if that is me, aside from creating an enormous web of tragedy amongst family, friends, and community members, and spending time in jail.
Yeah. I mean, it's bad on both sides. So I love this idea that we can do something about this. I think there's lots of things in my profession that are very hard to navigate, but this one's actually pretty easy.
Yeah.
To not drink and drive.
Yeah.
Right.
Not drink and drive, and don't be afraid to talk about it.
Yes.
Don't be afraid to talk about it. I think, parents can't be confident all the time in themselves, although I'm sure they on the outside they might, but there are no perfect parents. So be confident that you can have this conversation, and there's nothing wrong with going to MADD.org and using the resources, or going to, Families for Safe Streets, or, whatever the case may be. But there are resources out there that help us get to our end goal of ending impaired driving. And it starts young, and it starts with the conversation at home. And we like to supplement that in the school by having, trained specialists come in, and it's not a lecture, right? It's interactive. It's a way for students to hear it from two different types of people, your family and parents, and, someone in a classroom setting who can forge a bond or make an impact. And it's great. I still have one of our best prevention education specialists that I've seen. He walks into a middle school, and it's like guys and girls from 3 years ago in high school, 3, 4, 5 years ago when they were in middle school. Hey, you're the MADD guy. I remember you. Yeah. I haven't, let me tell you what happened. I was at this party, right? And so I think that we have to know there's a support system out there, and MADD wants to play a role in that wherever we can. We also want to equip parents and families with best practices, because nobody's perfect.
Yeah, this is hard. Thank you so much, Jerod, for all of this. Like, this has just been such a great conversation. I know it will benefit our families, but it has been lovely talking to you.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for the invitation. And this is 100% preventable crime. It starts with a choice. Don't ever get behind the wheel impaired, period.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again, Jerod, for that great information. I know that these are hard conversations to have, but we're so thankful that you were with us today to give us your tips and tricks and ideas of how to make these conversations easier, and how to support our kids and ourselves in this process of having these difficult conversations. With that, I will say thank you so much for your time today. Please like and subscribe to our show. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. And also keep the emails coming with future topic suggestions to accidentalexperts@gmail.com. Have a lovely day. Some words from our legal team.
The information presented in this podcast is not intended or implied to be a substitute for appropriate professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All content, including text, graphics, images, and information contained on or available through this podcast, is for general information purposes only This podcast makes no representations and assumes no responsibility for the accuracy or information on or available through this podcast, and such information is subject to change without notice. You are encouraged to confirm any information obtained through this program with other sources and review all information regarding any condition or treatment with the appropriate professionals.
What we're saying is, yes, I am a real therapist, but I'm not your therapist.